Hi, and welcome to this episode of Shaken Not Burned, a podcast about the big sustainability stories and solutions. My name's Heather Dinwoody, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Felicia Jackson. We're actually down a member this week, already in our second week, but Giulia will be joining us again once she's back from her holidays. And we all used to work together, and we firmly believe that sustainability and climate challenges can be met with the right solutions. We're going to be talking about the stories that we think tell us something about the way the world is changing, before speaking with changemakers that are actively working for a better future. So I'll be kicking things off today with a story that jumped out to me, and it's not the biggest story in the world, but I just think it opens up quite an interesting conversation. So Sysco, which is one of the UK's biggest wholesalers to the food service industry, so they're serving, things like event venues, hospitals, universities, all that kind of really sort of canteen kind of food. They have introduced a carbon labelling system in partnership with a company called Nutritics, and it looks really interesting. So it basically tries to calculate the carbon footprint of foods across the value chain. It does also account for waste management. It includes packaging, and I think they've also got a water footprint as well.
Oh, that's cool.
It really is. And where they can, they're using site-specific data, and where they can't, they're kind of supplementing that with peer-reviewed industry averages. So they're really doing their best to kind of give consumers an accurate understanding of the impact of different food choices. It can also be used by the chefs and the recipe designers. I'm sure there's a better word for that. Just to sort of help inform them when they're actually crafting their recipes, crafting their menus to make those low carbon choices. And the reason I picked this story is just because I think it opens up a really interesting conversation around kind of personal responsibility, I suppose, and also I would argue personal empowerment. So I've seen a few different surveys where they've kind of been sort of speaking to the public and seeing how they feel about this kind of carbon impact labelling. And I think we do have to bear in mind that these studies are slightly skewed, perhaps by all sorts of variations, really. Who's running them? Who are they sampling? So, for example, one of the big studies that's been done recently was by Oatly, the dairy-free company. And if they're surveying their consumers, then those might be people who are quite carbon conscious anyway. But what they've found, or certainly what survey results seem to suggest, is that people are interested in this. People feel that they would make lower carbon choices if they had access to information. And so many people don't have access to that information at the moment. It's just not commonplace. I do also know that the government has kind of been sort of looking into what it can do around this, whether maybe carbon footprinting on food items might be made mandatory at some point. So I suppose I sort of wanted to bring all of that to the table today and just discuss, how do we feel about this? Because I think on the one hand, I think it's great that people can be really empowered and informed to make choices that align with their values. But then on the other hand, I can't help thinking, yes, but all these big food and agricultural giants should be doing better. It can't all be on the individual. So where do we think that balance is?
I've got to jump in on this one because I do think that one of the biggest scams that existed is the fossil fuel industry making people feel that they're responsible for climate change, that we have to, not fly and not drive, and, that it's the responsibility of the individual to make better choices. Because I think that's important and it's a fundamental part of what we need to do. But we mustn't forget the fact that this is something that operates at every scale, and you can't expect people to be making better choices when companies refuse to do so. At the same time, I'm a big believer in information and labelling because you only have the choices in front of you. And if you don't have that information, you're not able to make an informed choice. So, it's something that can really help people who want to take back the power into their own hands and use their purse to make choices that are better for the planet. But at the same time, it is complicated because we have this situation where so much of the time it's the poor who suffer the brunt of climate change, whether that's, between the countries of the global north or the most vulnerable countries, in the global south, or whether it's that those people in so-called developed economies who are still struggling with, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis. So it becomes this really difficult, complex ball of interactions of, is this sort of choice something that's only freely available to those with the money to do it? Is it that, companies are putting that pressure on customers to make that decision? But in the end, I actually think it's part of a much bigger movement, which is to do with the growth and transparency. And you and I have talked about this a lot: traceability, trackability, transparency, understanding where things come from and where the impact is. Fundamentally, that's going to have to be something that happens for everyone and everything, because we talk about it here in terms of individual responsibility and knowledge. But actually what it's about is learning to understand our impact and the impact of our choices. What I love about this is it's not just CO2, that it's talking about waste, that it's talking about water. Because, and I know I've said this to you before, worrying about your carbon footprint is so 2010. I mean, I'm sorry, we need to do more. Carbon dioxide alone is not the issue. Even the fact that we measure global warming at the moment by CO2 emissions, when in fact it's supposed to be the global basket of GHG emissions, and we're a lot higher in those concentrations than simply CO2. Now, I know I'm spiraling. Too many of these things are massively interconnected. But I think I would say that my opinion on this, on the whole, is I think it's an incredibly positive step, but it's only part of the changes that need to be made if we're really going to make a difference.
I think you've raised some very interesting points there. I do think, it's interesting to talk about whether this is something that is currently reserved for those who can afford it, because certainly from my experience, and I would say actually, because I know a few restaurant chains and things are already doing this kind of carbon labeling, and it actually tends to be, the vegetarian options, the cheaper options that are lower in carbon. Now, you could argue that if it's restaurants that are doing it, that's already quite exclusive because it's only the people that can dine out. But I suppose with Sysco's move, that could be applied to, work canteens, as I say, to hospitals, to event venues, to places that aren't quite as exclusive maybe. And
that's a really, really interesting point, because there was me sort of ranting on about individual choices and the fact that we shouldn't be made to feel that it's our responsibility to affect change. But when you're actually talking about the fact that Sysco works with institutions, so it is that workplace canteen, it is that, still providing people with choice, but better choice, and it's not something they have to be responsible for at home.
Yeah, and I certainly think from these surveys, and as I've said, take everything with a pinch of salt, but people want this information and people are willing to act on it. So I think overall I am quite for this generally. I mean, certainly I think of myself dining out, and I think if I saw two different options, one with a much higher carbon footprint than the other, I personally would go for the lower carbon option, provided it wasn't, something I hated.
But I think there's also a really interesting point here, which is that people look at labels on food to make sure it hasn't got too much fat, or to make sure it doesn't have too much sugar.
Oh, I could have a whole other rant about this.
No, I know, but I'm just thinking about, how people will decide between two things for their own health. You know, if they're pre-diabetic, they're going to go for the lower sugar option. And actually what we're talking about is finding a way to label something to say, if you want to make a better choice for the health of the planet, choose this one.
Yeah. I would say, I think if we're going down the road of transparency, of empowering people to make decisions, to me, that is a road of saying, okay, we'll do our bit, but you're also doing your bit. It's almost a sort of mutual contract thing. My personal feeling is that if that is the road we're going down, then why stop there? Give people more information. Don't just tell them this is higher carbon than that. Tell them why. Give them the understanding. Tell them what you're doing in different areas. Tell them what's changing. But, people aren't going to read an encyclopedia every time they sit down to make a meal decision.
Yeah, no, so this is actually something I've had quite a few conversations about with people in the food and drink industry, because it's an incredibly competitive market. There's an incredibly small space that you can use to communicate with a potential purchaser. And they're trying to balance marketing, positioning, carbon labeling, mandatory food information, all of these different things. And there is this challenge that it's really expensive. And at a time, the UK has just gone into recession officially, at a time when it's challenging for individual companies to perhaps put that extra work into doing it, or pay for the analysis of the supply chain, it can be a real problem, and you could be putting another pressure on their ability to operate. But then this comes back to this whole issue of, how do we actually change the financial system in a way that you can actually encourage I hate to say the right sort of performance, but so you can encourage people to view not just financial returns. So if some company's only being measured on its financial return, then any extra cost is going to be a problem. But if it's being measured on its performance on financial capital, on human capital, on environmental capital, then the benefit to those actions, it would be able to measure and put on its balance sheet and say, we've made a little bit less money, but we've done this amazing thing and it's valued. So you, the investor, the public, the government, you have to accept that. I just think that's the best way forward.
And I think coming onto the financial system maybe brings us to the story that you wanted to discuss today. So
yes, indeed.
Do you want to go ahead?
Why not? The story I picked for this morning is actually, as Heather said about her story, it may not be the most important story in the world, but it's really important because it tells us about where we're going. And this is actually about the asset manager, AXA IM, so AXA Investment Management. And it's announced that it's updated its corporate governance and voting policy, basically putting more ESG expectations on companies. And it also included a pledge to target high emissions companies that are lobbying against the goals of the Paris Agreement. This is so important because it's an asset manager saying, we are going to expect better behavior from companies. We are going to keep track of whether you're lobbying against action on climate change and ESG. And the reason it's so important at the moment, I think, is especially in the US, there is this huge political backlash against ESG. It's become almost a bit of a joke. People joke about wokeness and, the fact that it's not sensibly financial. The reality is that ESG, which simply stands for environmental, social, governance, it is literally just a risk-adjusted investment lens. It's a way for investors to look at companies and go, given the way they're behaving in these areas, are there risks to future financial return? That's it. It's not even looking at impact yet. And yet, BlackRock used to be a proponent of ESG. Larry Fink has basically said he's not using the term anymore because it's too controversial. You've got Republican, is it states attorney generals? I'm never quite sure what the terminology is, but the attorney generals, and I think it's 17 Republican states, have put together court cases to demand that asset managers don't consider these considerations. How anyone can live in the world we're living in and look at the growth of extreme weather and the impact on supply chains and not say that's a potential risk to the operation of a company? How can you ignore that?
I mean, I've ranted before several times about how I just don't understand the anti-ESG movement, because to me it just seems daft, because as you say, ESG is about quantifying, monitoring risks. So to me, to say you're anti-ESG just is to say I'm going to ignore the risks. It does not make sense. So what I thought was quite interesting about this story, and what we haven't discussed about it yet maybe, is that it's about voting against, it's about taking an interest in companies' lobbying positions. And I find that fascinating. I mean, I've read a lot of sort of influence maps work around how policy and lobbying, sort of where companies fit with that, and I find it absolutely fascinating, because many of these companies, they might not necessarily be anti-ESG. They may have all of the ESG policies in place, but the professional associations they're part of might be lobbying for something that is anti-ESG, or they might be involved in lobbying activity that directly contradicts their own policies. So that's what I personally found really interesting about this story, was that it wasn't saying we're voting against people with, people who are going against ESG. It was specifically about the lobbying, and I just wondered if
no,
you
absolutely.
want to touch on that at all?
That was the new addition this year, because AXA has been quite good about being clear about engagement. I think the lobbying thing's really, really important, because the disconnect between acting one way and lobbying behind the scenes for rules about it to be weakened is hypocritical beyond the telling of it. The thing that's really interesting to me is the wider underlying debate about divestment versus engagement, and this idea: should you, as an asset manager concerned about climate risk and sustainability risk, should you stay invested in companies that are doing what we consider to be negative things and persuade them through voting and through pressure to change what they do, or do you sell them? Do you sell your stake? And basically, the idea of divestment is it's supposed to not only show discomfort with that company's behaviour, but also send a signal in the market that, people don't want to be invested in you. I think the real challenge we have today is, because of the politicisation of the discussion, and because of the short-term horizons of many investors, what happens is, if you divest, is someone who doesn't care will just buy it and not do anything. So you're really stuck between a rock and a hard place.
That's the thing. To sell a stake, you need a buyer.
And there are lots.
And to me, I always find this one difficult, because engagement only works if people are going to engage. But to me, I think there's something just dirty about divestment to me, because it really seems like washing your hands of something, saying, right, I'm not responsible for this anymore. And yet I've probably made a decent profit from it. And the second I'm not involved anymore, I can just, convince. I mean, it's like the old, the dog went to live on a farm or something, didn't it? Like being like, I handed it over to these people and I'm sure it'll be green and wonderful and sustainable next week. That's not the case. That they've bought it because they don't care.
Can I just say, though, that I do think it's more complicated than that, because I get that perspective. But there is this issue that, what do you actually do when you're a pension fund or an asset manager and you've been doing your investments as usual, and over the last 10, however many years, you've realised that climate change is a really big problem? It's a bit like the Church of England last summer. So they decided to exclude oil and gas from its portfolio. and especially companies engaged in the new exploration, production and refining of oil and gas, there's a caveat that they will think about investing in them if they are aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway. But the point is, the church basically said, we can no longer go along with this. The energy majors haven't been listening to the societies and markets where people are saying, you need to do things differently. And the Church of England, I think it was Alan Smith who said that the problem is they're not moving quickly enough. So what's happening, this comes back to the politicization, the arguments about whether, the level of risk. And so the Church of England pulled its pension funds out, its endowment funds out of those areas because it said, we have been trying to engage, but these companies are not responding. And at that point, you can't just keep going along with it.
See, this is the thing. I'm afraid my answer to this is entirely unrealistic and it's never going to happen. But I genuinely just feel that if you've ploughed however much money into, say, fossil fuels for however long, the way I see it, you can try and engage. If that's not working, oh dear. I don't think you should then sell it. I'm like, at what point can, what I really, my personal view, and as I say, this is so unrealistic, it's never going to happen in a million years. But I think you accept that as a stranded asset, say, well, we made a mistake there. And just, because otherwise you're just propagating it forward, Heather, in some way or another.
But Heather, I don't quite understand what you mean. Because if you're saying it's a stranded asset, you're still going to be making money from it if you're staying invested in it. And that's the whole point. They're trying to say, we're not going to be colluding with this behaviour. So I don't,
I suppose what I mean is stop financing it and just hang it up.
You can't do that without selling it.
Yeah, this is what I mean when I say it's unrealistic. You can't just hang it up and be like, okay, well, done.
You mean put it in the key drawer, and pretend it didn't happen?
Yes, exactly. Okay. I mean, I genuinely, my answer to this is put it under the bed and pretend it never happened. And I'm really hoping
we're probably going
to
have a little conversation about financial literacy and the construction of an economy, because I now see what you're trying to say. It's just that you can't do that. It's not that it's not realistic. It's that it's actually functionally impossible. You're either in or you're out. And the only way to be out is to sell it. Because if you're not selling it, you're in it.
Just put it under your pillow.
Okay. I mean, I like the idea. I really do. But yeah, I have absolutely no idea what to say to that.
I will just say for the listeners, I'm not the financial genius here, if you hadn't guessed. I'm just a bit willfully ignorant, I suppose.
I don't think that's fair, because I think for lots of people, we just don't spend much time talking about finance. And I'm obviously completely obsessed by it. But what I think is really interesting is your heart is just saying, but don't.
Yeah.
Because it's wrong. And actually, what's really difficult, I think, is the disconnect between the realities of how our economy works and the things that we instinctively know to be right. So I think it's one of the reasons why activism and finance just don't go hand in hand. And like everything else, we have to find new ways of communicating, collaborating, working together.
I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but it feels like being some massive big asset manager who has been investing in, say, fossil fuels or whatever for decades, it's like getting involved with the mob or something, isn't it? You can't get out.
What's the famous quote for every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in.
Exactly.
Okay, now listen, on that note, I think as Giulia's not here, I did pick a story for her. Won't go into it as long, but I think it speaks to the idea of how we can do things differently. And that's to invest in new ideas and new solutions. So the story I picked for Giulia is actually about concrete. And honestly, it's much more exciting than it sounds. It's actually, Microsoft has signed a deal to capture and store carbon in recycled concrete with a company called Neustark. Now, I'm not going to go into the massive details of the technology, but basically, Neustark uses recycled materials as a place to permanently store CO2 removed from the atmosphere, and it does it using mineralization. What's interesting to me here is that it's one option amongst many. There are, companies like Heirloom and AIcrete and Carbon Cure. There's the First Movers Coalition trying to find solutions to concrete, and this is because concrete is so important. It sounds really weird. I know we talk about CO2 a lot, but actually it's buildings and cities and this idea of how you actually deal with carbon in buildings. So concrete alone is responsible for, I think, about 7% of all global emissions. And part of the problem is it's because the process of making it is very, very, very high in CO2. Now, buildings themselves actually account for about 30% of energy consumption. And, the built environment overall is responsible for about a third of our total energy and process related emissions. And yet, what are we going to do without concrete? The population's growing. People are still building buildings. We need alternatives. We need lots of money going into these alternatives. And if we can find an alternative to concrete that stores CO2, and there are processes where actually you can put excess CO2 into new concrete, very, very cool stuff. We might talk about that at a later date. But I think what it's exciting to recognise is that there are solutions out there for change.
I think this one is really exciting to me as well, because it's not just about the carbon. And yes, it's fantastic that we can talk about storing carbon permanently, but it's also recycling. It's also displacing that new concrete from being made. And I harp on about circular economy all the time, but the construction industry, as well as its emissions, and I think it's worth distinguishing between the operational emissions of sort of managing a building, so heating and cooling and ventilating it over time, and the embodied carbon emissions, which is really what we're talking about here, which is the carbon emissions sort of associated with the construction materials and processes.
Totally.
But it's not just that, is it? There's so much, you think of demolition waste, you think of buildings coming up, coming down, all of those materials that are being continuously extracted, produced, wasted, and
dumped,
polluting, all of this stuff. And this seems to me like just one of those golden ideas that really, really takes us forward into this, not just a new way of thinking about concrete and buildings, which, yes, is huge on a global scale, but also just a new way of thinking about how we make things, how we design, how we handle material resources. It's a sign of something bigger if you look at it in the most hopeful perspective. And I do think Microsoft's involvement is really interesting, actually, because Microsoft, in terms of carbon solutions that they're investing in, they really have invested in a lot. I mean, I think you rattled off a few there. I think you mentioned Climeworks and Heirloom. I think Microsoft's supporting all of them. And I'm not necessarily going to sing its praises because it's hard for me to do so, frankly. But I think it's certainly worth keeping an eye on.
Well, I also think it's important to recognise that whether we like it or not, big corporations have a huge role to play in how we affect change. Think about Amazon being the largest owner of renewable energy in Europe. Think about the fact that the First Movers Coalition, which was set up under the WEF, that's got buyers, of that's not the First Movers Coalition at all. What it has is actually just construction and engineering firms. But they've got targets to have by 2030 a set percentage of their cement and concrete coming from low carbon sources. Big companies and the choices they make push things just as much as regulation does. Of course, it really helps if the regulation is there, because that is actually what makes companies all work together, collaborate, move things in a certain direction, because nobody's got an unfair advantage. And I think maybe the most important thing to remember about all of this is that if we're going to find the solutions we want, you talk about a golden opportunity. What it needs is for every part of the system to come together. We need individual choices. We need regulation. We need the right kind of investment. We need companies looking to the future. We need innovation. And we need to just accept that we need to change.
And I think, we're talking here about collaboration, and I think one of the interesting things here is the blurring of boundaries between sectors, because Microsoft is not a construction company, but you can see the pathway here, because Microsoft, like many big corporations concerned about carbon, invests in a carbon solution, and then that solution also happens to help with construction and development. And I just think the more working together we can do, the better things tend to get.
I think that's probably the underlying theme of everything we talk about, that we can make a difference. We just have to find ways of working together and do it faster.
Pretty much. And if they say no, we'll put them under our pillow.
I think you mean in the drawer, because putting them under the pillow sounds like you're planning on suffocating them.
Well, everything's got multiple meanings. I'll leave it up to interpretation. And I think that's all we've got time for our news session. So thanks for joining me, Fee. So that brings us to our interview. And today I'm joined by Leonardo Marcovitz, founder and chief executive of More Foods. So, hi Leonardo, and thanks again for joining me. I suppose we'll just dive right in. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at More Foods.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. My name's Leonardo Marcovitz. I'm the founder and the CEO of More Foods. More Foods is a company that makes delicious, tasty, meaty products that happen to be plant-based. We use plant proteins which haven't been explored in order to make these meaty products. And we don't try to be exactly like meat.
See, I like to hear that because I'm vegan myself and I'm all about trying the new flavors and things, but I don't necessarily want something that tastes like a pork chop. It's a difficult one. But what made you decide to go down this route? Why do you feel that this is so important?
Yes, so about 8 years ago, I stopped eating animal products. And then 5 years ago, I started to think, wow, I'm pretty passionate about this. I want to dedicate most of my time, all my time and my effort to help eliminate the use of animals in the food system. And the one way to do that is to create products that bring a similar experience to our plates, to the experience that animal-based ingredients and proteins bring to our plates. And by a similar, I don't mean, again, that it has to be the same texture or the same color. The main features of something, when I say similar, in our view, in More Foods' view, is delicious ingredients that are high in protein. They make you feel satiated, and they have a great bite. Those are the three features that we look for, and we developed our products, what we have in mind when we developed our products.
And you mentioned before that you're not using sort of the conventional plant-based protein. So could you tell me a little bit about what you are using?
Yeah, sure. So as you're probably well aware, most companies use soy, seitan, and pea protein. And those are great ingredients. We've been able to build and educate the market really well. And at the same time, soy and seitan sometimes have a somewhat negative perception. It doesn't mean that there's something intricately bad with the actual ingredients. This is one thing that I like making clear all the time. But it is sometimes a perception. And secondly, the name of our company, More Foods, we have to be able to explore and do different foods that are high in protein, right? So why have just soy, pea, and seitan? So what we did is we started to explore other ingredients that could allow us to make delicious products that are clean label, short ingredient list with no major allergens, and that could be affordable. And the path and the journey led us to pumpkin and sunflower seeds. So our products are made using these two ingredients as major protein sources. And there's a really cool story, or a very interesting story behind where we take these ingredients from. So pumpkin and sunflower seeds are both very high in oil content. So there's a whole industry that extracts oil from the seeds. And after the oil has been extracted, there's this leftover side stream. So we use the side streams in order to create our products.
I see. So you're really sort of valorizing the waste as well and just channeling it all back into something good. And what kind of stage is More Foods at? Have you raised funding to date? Are your products at market? Or
Yeah, sure. So, by the way, you mentioned for you what was important for you. A lot of customers, the number one reason they want to eat less meat, which is the flexitarians, is because they want to live healthier lives. And a lot of the products out there are not fitting into the considered healthy bucket, and that's one of the challenges that More Foods challenge that solves. By the way, that's why I mentioned the clean label, short ingredient list, etc. So going back to where we're at as a company, we launched initially our products in Israel, and we're in more than 100 restaurants. We're also in the catering of companies like Facebook, Apple, Samsung, Google. We launched also, our product is powering, More Foods is powering a white labeled product, which is now in the largest retailer in Switzerland called Migros. And we also now we have a warm pipeline of large customers in the UK. I can't disclose the names, but large customers in food service that are very interested in our products. And soon we'll start to serve our More Foods in their venues.
I see. So getting off to an exciting start then. And what are your next big milestones, or what can we expect to see next?
Sure. So we are the customers that we have relationships with now in the UK are pretty large. So this is something that'll be exciting to see how it evolves, or how it expands throughout the year, and how the launch is going, and that we're expanding is what I mean to say. And then other exciting things that are happening is now we have 3 cuts. We will develop, so we have a thin kind of a pulled product that we call pulled. We have another one that's like thicker, and we call it thick pulled. And we have another one that's cubes. You can make shepherd's pies. You can make different products. So we have those 3 cuts. We're developing other cuts as well. And our company is really about, we realize there's a lot of side streams in the food industry. So we have our eyes and More Foods always on valorizing different types of products that are side streams that can be used to create delicious and nutritious final products. And then a key thing in our as we expand in the UK, and then we're also expanding to other markets, is speaking with the right distributors. So if there are distributors that are listening to this, we'll be glad to speak with them. There is a clear market appreciation for a product, both on the taste, the texture, and also on the, more conceptual, the health credentials, the 27% protein, 7% fiber, clean label, and the short ingredient list. And especially also for food service, also it's very important. on the allergen, we contain no major allergens as well. So that's also something that's quite important, is to create the right relationships with the distributors. And then another aspect, you asked me before and I did not answer. Yes, we have raised capital. We've been extremely efficient. So we raised less than $2 million throughout the history of the company. And that's allowed us to get all the way from idea to prototyping to scaling to production to commercial sales, which is quite remarkable in this industry. If you do some market research and you look at just companies and how much in the sector they've raised until they get to a product market fit, until they get to the market, it's substantially more. So the other thing that we're looking for now is also to raise capital, and it's quite attractive for investors because you're probably, I'm not sure if you're aware, also like the conditions in the market right now, they're looking for companies that are effective with their capital. So we have a good track record.
Absolutely. And we're seeing worldwide as well a bit more of an interest in alternative proteins and this plant-based kind of movement. So what do you think are the kind of the key ingredients you need for success, if you like? So that could be policy measures, financial support. What are you hoping to see that you really think could stimulate that market?
I think that I'll share with you a little story that I think is an indicator of your, like, helps answer your question. So many times when I go and present to a customer, to a chef, okay, not now I do less of the direct sales, but I still do them, and when I speak with a customer, for example, a chef, many times so we cook a product, right? We speak for a few minutes, we cook the product, they taste the product, and many times what comes out of their mouth is, wow, not bad. So that's exciting because of two reasons. So one is they are acknowledging that something that's plant-based can be tasty, right? But on the same time, you can learn that they had an impression or a bias and they were expecting it not to be good. So it's the negative. But the positive thing is that there are more and more products that are tasty. And what we need to do is get more people. So like those chefs are willing to try it, and then they're surprised. And by the way, at the end of the meeting, they go from, in 40 minutes, they go from not bad to like, hey, you know what? That's actually really good. You can see the transition in their mindset, And I think this is something that could apply to society in general. So I think we have to get more people to try more products. No pun intended, by the way. More foods. The name of the company is More Foods, but not just more foods, but other great products to get them in the hands of people that they can try them. And I am convinced that even now we're at the stage where if people try great products, it's easy. They'll eat them. It's not rocket science. So if you ask me so that's like one mission that I think is very important, is to get more products for people to try more products. And then you can ask yourself, how could we do that, right? So yeah, maybe there could be a budget. I don't know. I don't have the exact solutions, but if governments would realize this, maybe they could allocate budgets for some subsidies, maybe at some fairs, for they buy or subsidize part of certain products that are good products, and people can taste them, and this incentivizes everyone. It incentivizes brands to showcase their products. It incentivizes consumers to try something because maybe they can get it at a reduced price, or maybe they can have a free sample, And it helps the government, by the way, in the long term, because if they eat healthier products, right? I'm not all plant-based products are healthy, but for example, ours are. Then it helps also the government because huge expenditure of the government is healthcare. So if they're eating healthier, then the healthcare costs will be reduced. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I, for one, will be looking forward to trying it. And for our listeners as well, if you'd like to find out more about More Foods, we'll include a link to the website in our show notes so you can get in touch with Leonardo and see where things go.
Wonderful.
And I think that's about all we've got time for today. So thank you so much again for joining me. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. And thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please be sure to follow our channel for future episodes, find us on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter. All the links you need can be found in the show notes.